If there's life elsewhere in the universe, as I bet there is, if we ever find it, it will be Darwinian life. I stick my neck out and predict that. The idea that the gene is the unit of selection, that's just the way population geneticists would express evolution. They would tend to put it at the level of the individual. The individual's fitness is measured by its success in reproduction, which means passing on its genes. I twisted that on its head and said, therefore, the gene's measure of success is how far it survives.
But you knew you were talking about some groundbreaking ideas.
Well, yes, sort of. I thought I was really putting into a different kind of language. The way I put it seemed to catch the public imagination in a way that it hadn't been caught. I've actually often been puzzled why it took so long for a Darwin to arrive on the scene. What Darwin did, it turns out, must have been clever because nobody did it before. But it's terribly simple.
It's funny because when a human would initially see that without training or science, they'd say, well, obviously that was created.
You see, a lion is a beautiful machine for chasing antelopes and killing them. And the antelope is a beautiful machine for escaping from lions. Well, whose side is God on? You cannot really reconcile, I think, a creator view with the fact that nature really is red in tooth and claw. There's an enormous amount of suffering. Predators are beautifully designed to kill the prey, and the prey are beautifully designed to escape from the predators. So you think that, obviously, what's God in it for? Does he like the spectator sport? Is he a sadist? You know, it doesn't make any sense.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Richard Dawkins, the evolutionary biologist, outspoken atheist, documentary filmmaker, and international best-selling author. You are an emeritus fellow at Oxford University, a fellow at both the Royal Society and the Royal Society of Literature, and considered one of the most respected scientists on the planet. You're the author of 17 books, including The Selfish Gene, the bestseller which popularized the idea of the gene as the fundamental unit of natural selection, and The God Delusion, which outlined your belief that science and reason naturally point towards atheism. You're also the first person to introduce the concept of memes as the cultural equivalent to genes, which has since brought rise to an entire field of study called memetics. Your latest book, Flights of Fancy, Defying Gravity by Design and Evolution, explores how nature and humans have learned to overcome the pull of gravity and take to the skies. Richard, welcome to London Real.
Thank you very much.
It's great to have you here. And I can't wait to jump into this book, Flights of Fancy, because first of all, I have two young boys. They're 5 and 6 years old, and the illustrations are incredible on this book. It's something I know their eyes are gonna go right to, and they're gonna start asking me all these questions about some of these animals that glide and some that fly and some insects. And so, I know you have another book where you had, illustrations, and it was also for a younger audience, but was this something that you wanted to do, or write a book for ages 8 to 80 for some time?
Yes, the earlier book you referred to is called The Magic of Reality. And in that book, each chapter begins with a question, something like, what is an earthquake? Why do we have winter and summer? And the chapter then begins with mythological answers to the question, myths from all over the world, and then it gives the scientific answer. And I thought I might do another volume of The Magic of Reality. And the first chapter I thought of was flight. But then flight kind of grew into a whole book, which became Flights of Fancy. And I enjoy learning up all aspects of a subject, including the physics and the biology and the mythology, actually. And so yes, that's how it got started.
And you kind of open the book and talk about how, as humans, we are fascinated by flight. And you go back to maybe the old drawings of Michelangelo. And I was telling you earlier, I used to fly helicopters. And I just remember being in the air in this device thinking, this is just magic. Like, I can't believe I'm up here. And what is this fascination?
I think a helicopter must give you a wonderful feeling of freedom, because
it does.
You can land anywhere you like and take off again.
And it's very unrestricted. We can hover and fly with the doors off. And
so it's rather like a hoverfly, which can dodge around and stand hovering still, and then go backwards, upwards, forwards, downwards, even upside down, actually, which I wouldn't recommend in a helicopter. Yes, I think everybody is, most people are fascinated by flight, and many people share with Leonardo da Vinci the ambition to try to get up in the air. And he designed many flying machines, none of which would have worked, but he obviously had this great ambition.
There's a picture in the book of one of his drawings. I think it looks like a hang glider, maybe. It looks like maybe an early version.
Some of his things look like hang gliders. He also had various flapping versions, what were called ornithopters, where the man in the harness was supposed to flap his arms and obviously trying to mimic a bird. That turned out to be the wrong answer. You can't do it by mimicking a bird.
Right.
You have to start from scratch. He also designed a kind of helicopter which was an Archimedes screw, a screw that's supposed to screw itself into the air. And the motive power for that was 4 men with a capstan running round and round and round in a sort of runway. And of course muscle power couldn't possibly generate enough power to lift themselves. But it had no stabilizing, what on a modern propeller is provided by the rear propeller. Otherwise it just spins round and round and round, and that's all. Even if his machine had got off the ground, it would have just spun round and round and round.
Yeah. Do you think if he had the materials and the electric motors in his lifetime, he might have been able to create something?
Well, yes. If he'd had enough, human muscle power is not enough. It depends upon a much greater source of power than that.
Right. And in the book, you kind of go through the hot air balloon, and then we kind of see the Wright brothers, and it's kind of fascinating to know that 6 decades later, now we're on the moon. I mean, it's amazing.
That's an astonishingly short time, actually, from the Wright brothers to Neil Armstrong. Ridiculously short space of time.
Yeah. I had my sons out, and we were watching the moon, and I was explaining the phases of the moon, and I said they put a man on the moon, and they both look at me like I'm crazy. Like, it's still almost inconceivable if you're a human on this planet to look up there and think, we put one of our people up there.
It's a long time ago now. I mean, it's amazing that such a long time has elapsed since that time.
Yeah, 60 plus years. I think they're going back. It's the latest.
Yes, the mission was cancelled a couple of days ago.
Okay, all right, but the plan is there. So in the book, you start looking into all sorts of variations of flight, gliding, and all sorts of some of the evolutional implications on that. What did you discover in writing this book?
I learned about how planes work, for example. I was always a bit vague about what keeps them in the air. I still don't really understand how they manage to carry enough fuel to keep themselves up in a great big airliner that can fly actually from here to Australia.
It's amazing.
Without stopping. To carry enough fuel to convey that fuel all the way, let alone all the passengers and goods and things that it can do as well, I find very difficult to understand. I mean, I understand the physics of it, but I didn't understand the economics of it. And I didn't really know about Bernoulli's principle and the fact that planes work in 2 different ways, the Newtonian and the Bernoulli way, so I learned that. And I learned about aerial plankton, lots of different things.
And you also learned that some things that we recreate with mechanics aren't recreated in nature. So there's no natural organisms that are lighter than air per se.
Yes, that's right. One of the ways, one of the chapters of the book is about lighter than air flight, balloons using either hot air or helium or hydrogen. I kind of try to speculate about we'll try to wonder why it is that no animal has done that, because the ingredients are there. I mean, there are organisms that produce hydrogen and methane, which is also lighter than air. And there are organisms that produce silk, and silk is good for making the envelope of a balloon. But no animals actually put them together. So there are plenty of animals that float about, not exactly lighter than air, but where the surface area is so large compared to their volume and their weight. One of the points of physics is, as you know, that the smaller an object is, the larger is its surface area compared to its volume. So something like the fairy fly Tinker Bella, which is actually a wasp, we've got a picture of it in the book, flying through the eye of a needle. It's so small that it would hardly need to bother to fly, it just kind of float around, not because it's lighter than air, but because its surface area is so great that the slightest waft of breeze, the slightest upcurrent, will just lift it without any effort. Whereas if you're as big as a human, as big as Leonardo, your surface area is so tiny compared to your weight that's not a chance. You just plummet to the ground.
Right, it's very hard because it's kind of, it's like r squared versus r cubed, right?
Exactly, yes.
It's the surface area is a squared ratio,
Yeah.
and the other one is a cubed ratio. So
Exactly.
it gets to a point where it's almost physically impossible to have flight at certain sizes.
Yes, that's right.
Did you find out what was the largest flying being? Was it a dinosaur?
Well, Quetzalcoatlus was a pterosaur, a sort of giant pterodactyl, which was the size of a small aircraft, the size of a Piper Cub or a Cessna. And it must have mostly glided. It probably tried to flap a bit, but it must have glided, I suppose, from high places. A giant pterosaur, a huge, great glider. And I suppose it probably took off from cliff tops and things. There is a suggestion that it might have punted itself into the air with using its elbows, and then it got into a thermal. But it probably made use of thermals like modern vultures and eagles do.
Okay. And you even talk about why. Like, why is flying something that was developed?
My kind of biologist is very keen on the question why, by which we mean what is the Darwinian survival value? What is it about flight that helps the animal to pass on its genes, survive to pass on its genes? And there are all sorts of different reasons. I mean, looking for food, escaping from predators, pouncing on prey from above, migrating to different places to keep up with climate changes. All sorts of different reasons why flight. It's almost a question that answers itself. It seems so obvious to us that flying would be a wonderful thing to be able to do.
I guess we look at how we use it, like you said, the international travel and cost effectiveness.
Yes.
What do we use drones for? Like just to get better views of things?
Yes, quite, yes, yeah.
And what was reconfirmed about evolution in doing all of this study that you saw? Were you reminded of certain things, or were certain things surprise you about some of the evolution of some of these beings?
I wouldn't say surprise, because I'm sufficiently imbued with Darwinism now that nothing very much surprises me. I suppose there are some quite remarkable adaptations in detail, things like, well, I just mentioned hummingbirds. Sorry, I mentioned hoverflies, but hummingbirds do it too, hovering like a helicopter. I became very fascinated by the symbiotic relationship between plants and insects and birds, pollinators, because the plants need their pollen to be transported from the male flower to a female flower. And some plants do it by wind, but I'd speculate, wouldn't it be wonderful if plants could have a little winged chariot to carry their pollen? And they probably would have evolved, excuse me, I should have warned you, I'm liable to, ever since I had a stroke in 2016, liable to get croaky throat.
Okay, yeah, no worries. That was 6 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm. Plants would have benefited from having a little winged chariot to carry their pollen from male flower to female flower. But why bother? Because there are butterflies and bees and hummingbirds and sunbirds. And so all you need to do is bribe them or seduce them. In the case of orchids that look like a female bee or a female wasp, and the bee tries to copulate with the flower and gets dusted with pollen, gets covered with pollen, and then goes off and tries to copulate with another flower and delivers the pollen. And there are advanced versions of this, like the hammer orchid, which has there are about a dozen different species of hammer orchid in Australia, and each species has one species of wasp which it's partnered with, so to speak. And these wasps, the male flies, the females don't have wings. The females just climb onto a plant somewhere, and the male comes and seizes the female and carries her off in his arms and mates with her on the wing. Well, these orchids have a dummy female on the end of a sort of arm with an elbow in the flower. So the male comes along, grabs the female, tries to lift her up, and the elbow of the plant bends, and the male gets smashed against the place where the pollen is, repeatedly, bang, 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 like that, and gets covered with these so-called pollinia, which are great big lumps of pollen that orchids have. Finally, he gives up on the effort to make off with this dummy female, flies off, and not having learned his lesson, grabs another one. And again it goes bang, 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 and this time he delivers the pollen. That's an astonishingly detailed mechanism. There's another one called the bucket orchid, where there's a bucket filled with, the flower has a sort of bucket filled with fluid, filled with water. And it's got a slippery edge so that a male bee of a certain species only slips on the edge, falls into the water, and then swims and tries to struggle to rise, and finds the only way to escape from this bucket of water, so to speak, is through a tiny hole. And it struggles through this hole, and on its way through gets pollinia stuck to its back, so it flies off, and then again, sadder but not wiser, excuse me, falls into another one, and then struggles through that hole, and then in this case the pollinia gets scraped off its back. Well, think of the intricate detail of the device by which these flowers get themselves pollinated, seducing a particular kind of insect. In the case of figs, it's even better, because there are about 900 different species of fig, and each one has its own private species of wasp, tiny little wasps. You don't think of it as being like a real big yellow jacket. It's a little tiny wasp. And the very, very complicated cycle of activity, relationship between these wasps and these figs. A fig is actually not a fruit at all. It's a flower. There's a lot of flowers are inverted, a sort of chamber in which there are lots of flowers on the inside. And the relationship between the fig and the wasp is very, very complicated, extremely complicated. As I say, there are about 900 different species of fig and about 900 different species of fig wasp. And each species of fig has one species of fig wasp. So it's a real magic bullet that takes the pollen to the correct species of fig.
Yeah. And that's all through evolution.
Yes. It evolves by Darwinian natural selection. The ultimate beautiful detail of these adaptations that come about through Darwinian natural selection inspires me.
You mentioned the one with the bee and is trying to mate with this organism and is bouncing back and forth.
Yes.
And it's funny because when a human would initially see that without training or science, they'd say, well, obviously that was created to make that. But they don't see the millions and millions of years.
They don't see
the
that.
mutations that created this thing that now seems designed.
There's the other thing that might occur to them, not with respect to the hammer orchid, but with respect to, say, lions and antelopes, you see a lion, which is a beautiful machine for chasing antelopes and killing them, and the antelope is a beautiful machine for escaping from lions. Well, whose side is God on? I mean, why would he create, if he wants the lion to eat the antelope, why make it so difficult? And if he wants the antelope to escape from the lion, why make the antelope so fast at getting away from the lion? Why make the lion so good at catching antelope? So you cannot really reconcile, I think, a creator view with the fact that nature really is red in tooth and claw. There's an enormous amount of suffering, and the predators are beautifully designed to kill the prey, and the prey are beautifully designed to escape from the predators. So you think that, obviously, well, what's God in it for? Does he like the spectator sport? Is he a sadist? It
Right.
doesn't make any sense.
And we only see that because it's in homeostasis. If for some reason the lion was much better, there would be no prey.
Exactly. Yes.
And if the prey was so much better, there would be no lion.
Yeah.
And so we see this probably very temporary view. I mean, that might not exist 1,000 years from now or even 100 years from now because the world will change. But when we see it, it's very easy not to see the evolution behind it. And we see something that was created for us, like we might see a product that was created for us, or a beautiful coffee maker that does something similar.
We are surrounded by machines that are made for our benefit, by things, not just machines, but everything we look at, and all these cameras around here, and they're obviously made by somebody, there's no question about it. And so it's very, very tempting when you see a beautiful mechanism like an eye, which looks like a camera, to think of that as being designed, and it takes a great leap of brilliance, actually, which Charles Darwin had, to recognize, I think the reason why I've actually often been puzzled why it took so long for a Darwin to arrive on the scene, because actually his idea is remarkably simple. I mean, it doesn't require a lot of mathematics and a lot of sophisticated thinking. But 200 years after Newton, what Newton did was very, very, very clever. What Darwin did, it turns out, must have been clever because nobody did it before. But it's terribly simple. And I think the reason that it took so long is that the eye looks so like a camera, looks so like a device that must have been designed, that people just didn't even dare to contemplate the possibility that it was anything but something designed.
Right.
Darwin saw it because he was a naturalist, he saw so much, but he also knew a lot about domestication. He studied pigeons and dogs. So he saw the power of selection to change a wolf into a bulldog or into a Pekingese, and saw how quickly selection by the human eye can produce this dramatic change. And all he had to do was to say, well, maybe you don't need a human eye to do the selection. Maybe it can be done by nature. So I've got to stop again.
No worries. And with Darwin, did the public embrace his ideas immediately, or did it take some time?
Some did. Many did not. Some churchmen did. Charles Kingsley was a devout churchman who did. Many people found it very difficult. Wallace, Alfred Wallace, who was Darwin's co-discoverer, wrote to Darwin and said, to you and me, it's as clear as daylight that the power of selection can be done by nature, not just by the human. And natural selection, Darwin's phrase, was as clear as daylight to Wallace, but so many people misunderstand it. They cannot conceive that you can get selection without a selector. And so Wallace begged Darwin to change his phrase from natural selection to survival of the fittest, which has less of an implication of there being a selector. And Darwin did adopt the phrase survival of the fittest, which had actually been invented by Herbert Spencer, but Wallace tried to persuade Darwin to adopt it. So Darwin continued to use the phrase natural selection alongside survival of the fittest.
Are there problems with using the language of survival of the fittest? Like, do people hear fittest and think it's the strongest, which it isn't always?
Well, that's right. When in Darwin and Wallace's time, that's what it did mean. It meant the strongest, the keenest of eye, the sharpest of wit, and so on. And later on, when geneticists started to get involved in evolutionary theory, which was quite a bit after Darwin, quite a bit after Darwin's death, after Mendel's genetics had been rediscovered at the beginning of the 20th century. Mathematical geneticists needed an algebraic symbol, they called it W, fitness. So fitness became it's almost a tautology. Just the fitness of an animal was its capacity to survive and reproduce, measured as, for example, the number of its grandchildren or the number of its great-grandchildren. So the survival of the fittest became a tautology because that's how you define fitness. In Darwin's time, it was not a tautology because it really did mean the strongest or the swiftest or the cleverest. But then in the hands of the population geneticists, survival of the fittest became a tautology. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. You might as well say, if you objected to it as a tautology, you would say, I don't know, it's no good breeding racehorses for speed because it won't work because it's a tautology. I mean, of course it'll work. The original meaning of fitness as speed in this case is still there. But I don't like using the word fitness actually for that kind of reason. But it is a favourite word of evolutionary geneticists.
Some people have called you the Rottweiler of Darwin. Is that a compliment?
I was called that, yes. Well, it was a takeoff from Huxley, who was called Darwin's bulldog.
Okay.
But actually, Rottweilers are very charming, sweet dogs, so I don't really worry about it.
Was this something at an early age that just naturally clicked with you? Those ideas of Darwin. I know you were brought up with various exposures to the church, but early on did
not really. I mean, I think my father explained natural selection to me. He'd read botany at Oxford. He was a biologist, but I didn't really appreciate it. I mean, I understood it, but I didn't think it was a big enough theory to do the job. And I think it was only when I was about 15 that I kind of realized that it actually was big enough to do the job. And there's nothing else. I mean, it has to be big enough, but it is too. I mean, now we know it's plenty of evidence that it really does work.
When you grew up in Kenya, did that exposure to nature and the animals?
Well, actually, I left Kenya when I was two, so
okay.
No. But I could have done because my parents then moved to what was then Nyasaland, which is now Malawi, which is also in Central Africa. But no, I wouldn't say that I was that exposed to wildlife in a way that I rather now wish I had and have been since. I mean, I've been back to Africa frequently and have been filled with great pleasure to go around national parks and things.
I spent some time in Botswana.
Me too, yes.
Oh, it's magical.
Yes, I quite agree.
It's like a 24-hour-a-day show. It's just incredible to see what's happening and the biology and the evolution and the interactions between prey and predator, and it's all right there in front of you.
Yeah, I quite agree.
When you wrote The Selfish Gene, did you know it was going to be such a big deal?
No.
It's your first book?
Yes. I remember jokingly referring to it as my bestseller while I was writing it, and obviously I hoped, I suppose any author hopes it will be a bestseller.
But was that a joke, or did someone?
It was a joke.
But you knew you were talking about some groundbreaking ideas.
Well, yes, sort of. I mean, they were. I thought I was really putting into a different kind of language ideas which were current among professional biologists. Indeed, I was. That's exactly what I was doing. But the way I put it seemed to catch the public imagination in a way that it hadn't been caught before. It was the idea that the gene is the unit of selection, and that's just the way population geneticists would express evolution. they would tend to put it at the level of the individual and say the individual, individual's fitness is measured by its success in reproduction, which means passing on its genes. I twisted that on its head and said, therefore, the genes' measure of success is how far it survives.
Right.
So, and that seemed to me to be a much simpler way of putting it, because if you talk at the level of the individual organism, then you have to say the individual organism is not trying to survive, except insofar as survival leads to reproduction. And not just reproduction, but passing on genes to the next generation and so on. I thought it was a much simpler thing to simply go straight to the level of the gene and say that it's the gene that's the level of selection, and it's the gene is using the individual organism as what I called a survival machine to get itself passed on. So the organism, the individual, is a tool of the genes to get passed on. And those genes that are successful are the ones that are very good at building individual bodies. But the body is a machine for passing on the genes that created it.
Right, yeah. That's a pretty groundbreaking advancement of the theory. Have you ever thought what it would be like to have this conversation with Darwin about your work and his work?
It would be wonderful to do so, of course. I once actually was invited by a Japanese television company to meet an actor dressed up as Charles Darwin and explain to him what had happened since his time. And it was quite fun. I mean, it was an English actor, not a Japanese actor. And he was quite a good actor. He was dressed up, covered with grease paint, and looking like Darwin. And the grease paint kept on dropping off, and the makeup girl had to come along and put it back on again and things. And I had to explain to him about Mendelian genetics, because this was a puzzle that had faced Darwin in his own lifetime. Nobody knew anything about genetics at the time. It was just sort of vaguely known that like begets like, that there's a tendency for children to look like their parents. But it was sort of thought to be a kind of mixture. You were thought to be a sort of blend of your mother and your father. That's the way it appears. I mean, people do tend to have the attributes of both their mother and their father. Sometimes more of one, sometimes more of the other. But it was thought to be blending, a bit like mixing paint. You get red paint and blue paint, and you mix them together, and you get purple. But it was pointed out in Darwin's time that once you've got the purple, no amount of mixing purple with purple will give back your blue and red, and so the variation just disappears. So there's not enough variation for selection to work on. And there was a man called Fleming Jenkin writing, I think it was a review of The Origin of Species in a Scottish journal, in which he said, therefore, natural selection is impossible.
Right.
Which is actually silly, because any fool could see that, as a matter of fact, I mean, if he'd been right, grandchildren should look more uniform than their grandparents, right, which is not true. So Fleming Jenkin was simply, it's written Fleming, but it's pronounced Fleming. Fleming Jenkin was simply saying manifest facts are impossible, which is ridiculous, of course. But nevertheless, his criticism did worry Darwin. And the solution to the problem is Mendelian genetics, which is digital. You are not a mixture of two paints. You're a mixture. It's more like beads of different colors being shuffled together in a sack. The red beads and blue beads don't make purple beads. They still say red and blue. And so, in Mendelian genetics, what happens is that genes just go on unmixed with each other to the next generation. Your grandparents' genes are in you, intact. Only a quarter of your genes from each grandparent, but they don't mix together. They just shuffle together. Right. That's the answer to the Fleming-Jenkin problem, which Darwin never knew about. Mendel's work showing that genetics is digital in that sense had been done in Darwin's lifetime, but Darwin unfortunately never read it. Nobody else did, hardly. It was published in a rather obscure journal, and its significance was simply overlooked until the beginning of the 20th century. And then, even then, it took a while for anybody to realize that this was the answer to the Fleming-Jenkin riddle. So it was my job to explain this to the actor for this Japanese crew. I had to sort of answer the door, and Mr. Darwin, I'm delighted to meet you.
Were you very nice to him and reverential?
Of course I was. And then I explained to him about this thing, and he was that's it. He said, he did it very, very nicely. So that was rather a nice
Is that what
experience.
Darwin would have said, do you think?
Well, I suspect he would probably,
Right.
yes. I think he would.
It's so clear,
Yes.
and it's an explanation.
Yeah, yes.
Wow. And so you published in 1976, Selfish Gene. The book goes around the world. It affects so many people in so many ways. Why? And why then? Was it the timing?
I have no idea. I mean, I think it's a very clear idea, and I think I just put it into words, yeah. But
You mentioned when Darwin came out that there were churchmen that bought onto his thesis.
yes,
Which surprised me when you say that, because I thought maybe even back then there would be no churchman that could keep his job that might subscribe to that. And obviously this has been a huge part of your work, is going up against churches and doctrines.
well, nowadays most sophisticated, educated churchmen have no problem with it. There are plenty of unsophisticated, relatively uneducated religious people who think there is a problem, because they take the book of Genesis literally, and it would devastate their worldview if they had to depart, for they've been brought up from childhood onwards to believe that every word of the Bible is true. It's an odd belief, because if you actually think about who wrote the Bible, there's no reason whatever to think they knew anything at all. I mean, just it was written by herdsmen in Palestine or in Babylon, actually. It wasn't written until the Babylonian captivity, but came from earlier legends.
Right.
Every tribe in the world has its own creation myth, and everyone is different, and they don't originate from anybody who knew what he was talking about. They just grew up in some sort of mysterious way. But still, there are plenty of people in America brought up to believe that every word of the Bible is literally true, just as people in the Muslim world are brought up to believe that every word in the Quran is literally true. Therefore, it's a terrible thing for them to have to lose this rock which they've been brought up with, the holy word of God. But then, actually, if you talk to a bishop or an archbishop or most clergymen of the Anglican or of Catholic Church, at least, they're quite happy with Darwinism.
So the more educated they are, the more they're okay with it.
Yes.
But if you're not that educated and you just tend to take it on faith, and it's a big part of your identity, and you don't go further,
yes, that's right.
then you just accept it as true,
yes,
and move on. So it's a bit of a lazy way to look at religion.
Well, I suppose so. I mean, I'm not sure which of them more lazy, but yes.
Does it still surprise you when you walk around, say, London or England, that religion is so woven into this culture? I mean, I was down at Buckingham Palace over the weekend, and there's a beautiful story of Queen Victoria, a beautiful statue of Queen Victoria, and she's holding like an orb and a staff. And I remember thinking of the televised coronation of Queen Elizabeth, and I remember thinking, they say she's a descendant of God, and like that was this is what, or connected to God. I mean, isn't that, there's divinity there?
I don't think they do, right? Really. You know, I mean, the coronation service is taken from the Bible. I mean, you know, the anointing with oil and things that comes from Zadok the priest,
right?
In the Old Testament. So there's a kind of semi-serious buying into the myth of anointing with oil, making you somehow divine, the divine right of kings, which caused so much war and horror in history that nobody believes that anymore. The Queen still is the head of the Church of England ever since Henry VIII. The monarch has been the head of the Church of England, but people in Christian faith is not very widespread in this country. If you look at, my foundation, the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science in Britain, did a survey. In 2011, there was a census. There's a census in Britain every 10 years, and there's one in 2011, one in 2021. One of the questions in the census is you get asked, what's your religion? And people tend to tick Christian because they were brought up. They're not Muslim, they're not Jews, so they're Christian. They tick Christian. But if you actually, what we did was to take a sample of people who tick the Christian box and give them a detailed set of questions to see whether they really were Christian, and they weren't. Very few of them were. We asked them, do you believe Jesus is your Lord and Savior? I forget what the faith figure was, but it was very low. Do you believe in God? Was slightly higher, but not much higher. So don't think that just because the Queen is constitutionally head of the Church of England, that therefore people in Britain believe in Christianity. A few do, but not that many do.
And fast forward 100 years from now, will the church?
Well, I would think so, but I don't know. Well, when I say not many, I mean it's something under 50%. But so it is some. But the figure is much higher in America, but it's coming down in America, and the number of people who now subscribe to no religion in America even is, I think, up about 25%.
Right. The Richard Dawkins in 1976, when you were studying genetics and publishing The Selfish Gene, did you ever think that you would be having discussions about religion and you would write a book called The God Delusion? Or was this always going to be a collision course?
Well, I never thought of it as a collision course, but there is a certain amount of, even in The Selfish Gene, there's a certain amount of anti-religion assumption there.
And when you wrote The God Delusion, what was the reaction, and how did that change your perception?
The reaction was, I suppose, predictably mixed. It's the best-selling book I've written. It sold even more copies than The Selfish Gene, although it's a newer book. They both sold several million copies, but The God Delusion more so. I think the reaction was what you might expect. There was very positive and very negative, depending upon who you talk to.
Right. And we've had Lawrence Krauss here, and you made a movie with him called The Unbelievers, where
yes,
you kind of toured the world. I think you were doing speaking events in various places. I think it ended up in Sydney. And I watched that when Lawrence was on the show 5 or 6 years ago, and it was just interesting to see you two engage with audiences and speak openly and frankly with sometimes religious zealots and other people. And what's it like having those conversations or having those discussions? Does it get to a point where with some people there's no discussion to be had, or are most people willing to engage?
It's very variable. I mean, they're usually fairly amicable. I mean, we don't very seldom have kind of slanging matches. I've usually had rather friendly audiences. I suppose it's just the friendly ones come. I mean, I think perhaps the antis don't tend to turn up. I've had a fair number of interviews with devout people, but they've been friendly.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.